Poppies is an astonishing poem. It's just a marvellous reason to study English literature. One of the fabulous things about this poem is that it exists in two different states. It's two different things at the same time. So if I could illustrate that, here we have the poppies that you'd see in a field, but at the same time they represent for us the death of soldiers. That's dramatised here with a soldier walking towards war, but also as though walking towards death. And this is the subject matter of the poem, but also its structure. The poppies and the boy in the poem represent two different things. One is a soldier and the other is a son. When students meet poems like this, they often feel unsettled, as though there should be a meaning, and they're unhappy that it switches from one meaning to another. But with images we might be a bit happier. So here we have a woman cloaked here, walking between trees, but if we follow the outline here, we can see the outline of a face, and these become eyes. We're quite happy with these sorts of images that are more than one thing at the same time. Here we have another famous one. This is the chin and the cheek and the nose and the forehead of a young girl, but at the same time this is not the young girl's ear. Now it's an old woman's eye. This is her hooked nose, and here's her mouth and chin. Again, an optical illusion. And an easier one here. This is the duck's beak. Oops, but hang on. This is the rabbit's face, and those are its ears. Well, the reason I've begun this way is so that you can see that visually we're used to dealing with two realities existing at the same time. And don't panic when this happens with the poem. Jane Weir wrote this poem with a mixture of sadness and anger, and these two emotions are played out in the descriptions in the poem. So the first interpretation I'm going to deal with is this idea that this is a war poem, and the whole poem is about war. Let's see how that works. The poem begins 3 days before Armistice Sunday, and that's the Sunday nearest the 11th of November, when we remember all the soldiers who have fallen in wars. But this is juxtaposed immediately with the moment when you left. So we have here a mother talking about a son who has left going to war. So she's pinned onto his lapel a poppy with its petals. The petals are crimped because it's not a real poppy, it's made of paper or fabric. And we can see that she uses the language of violence and death to describe her son's departure. So the poppy is in spasms of red, reminding us of what's going to happen to the son when he gets killed, presumably in some horrifying way. And then the red of the poppy is clearly symbolic of his blood. Here the blazer that he's wearing could be his uniform, and he has a blockade of fabric on it. The blockade suggests the mother's emotions. She wants to block him going off to war, but realises that she's powerless to do it. And the blockade also suggests the way that he might have been killed, trapped by an enemy encircling him. Now the descriptions become bitterly ironic. So, for example, she's wrapped sellotape around her hand, but the description of it is bandaged, as though to help lessen the damage on herself. And what's ironic here, of course, is that it doesn't help her, and more importantly, it didn't help her dead son. He's obviously died after being wounded, if we follow the analogy through here. The mother has used the sellotape to clean the cat hairs off his uniform, but here the language she uses is rounded up, and that reminds us entirely of how enemies are captured. So we've got a sense here, just through allusion and language, that the son's been injured, hence bandaged, and then been rounded up by the enemy. This is further suggested by the white cat hairs, white here an image of surrender. So she imagines her son being part of an army that's been defeated. Watching her son go off to war like this actually turns her into a soldier in her mind's eye. So instead of having a soft face, she deliberately makes it steel. She makes it hard like a weapon. She wants to remember what she was like with him with him as a child, like we did when you were little. But instead, she's resisting because she has to harden herself to the fact that her son is going to risk his life going to war. His gelled hair then becomes violent in her imagery, blackthorns, prickly, harsh to the touch, and perhaps reminiscent of the kind of barbed wire landscape we're used to from the First World War. Next, she describes her own language as though it's been assaulted by war. So the words have been flattened and rolled as though turned over by a tank and turned into felt. Felt, of course, is a fine material such as you'd find on a snooker table, and this material reminds us of the ground once the tanks have been across it. Perhaps we can imagine soldiers underneath tyre tracks here that have been turned completely flat. This, of course, is also a pun, so that the felt here is feeling. So her words have turned into feelings which are slowly melting. This perhaps is grief, the feeling of grief that she can't prevent her son going to war, and she can't prevent the possibility and likelihood of his dying. Next, she seems to try to understand her son's motivation. She threw the door open as though in excitement, reflecting his excitement, and war to him is a world overflowing like a treasure chest. He can see only the positive benefits of going out to war, whereas she has focused only on the idea of his death. The moment that he leaves is also dealt with ironically. It's only a split second for him to walk out of the door, but the split second is also a reminder to us that this is how long it takes to die, and so the "you were away" is a literal description of him leaving, but also a euphemism for death. And then we've got his final emotion as he goes. He is intoxicated. Here, the mother is critical of his desire to go. It's like being drunk. It's difficult for us to know whether she blames him. It's possible that other forces have intoxicated him. In other words, he hasn't deliberately gone out to seek this emotion, but this is what society has done to young men. It's told them that war is glorious, something wonderful, a treasure chest. If we follow this reading through, then "after you'd gone" is again a euphemism for death, as well as the literal description of his leaving. "I went into your bedroom, released a songbird from its cage." So this is obviously symbolic. It could symbolise his soul being released from a cage. So in death, his soul has been released. It's very unlikely to be an actual bird because of the word "a" here. And he's not likely to have more than one bird in a cage in his bedroom. The other thing it might symbolise is her own grief. We might imagine this is the sound that she has emitted in the bedroom, perhaps a scream as she gets news that her son has died, or as she imagines his death. The symbolism of the bird being the soul is carried forward here with the single dove. Again, because there's only one dove, it reminds us of just the one person, her son, which has flown from the pear tree. Well, pear obviously is a homophone here. So they are the pair, the mother and son, but now they've been torn apart by war. And this is where it has led her skirting the churchyard walls, so as though looking for his grave. We can see that her grief means that she's no longer thinking straight. Consequently, she's gone out in the winter. It's November, remember. She's hatless. She's not wearing a winter coat, and she ironically describes these clothes as reinforcements, again using this military language to show her grief at the fact that he's been killed in war. Next, the church is on top of the hill, and so that's a literal description, but reaching the top of the hill is like the soldiers going over the top in the trenches. Once again, we're reminded of the First World War. That's where the war memorial comes in, and she leans against it like a wishbone. Now, wishbones have several characteristics. One of them is that it's the legs that are spread. And this would mean that her body is the single figure here, like this. Her arms, therefore, must be kept in at her sides, and her legs spread wide as though collapsing. This is an image of her physical grief at the war memorial itself. It also works as a kind of oxymoron, because it's made up of the word wish and the word bone, and we can clearly imagine that what she wishes is for her son to be alive, but the reality is that he's dead, he's skeleton, he's bone. And the other characteristic of wishbones, of course, is when we make our wish, we snap them in half, just like the son's wish to go to war has snapped in half the relationship between mother and son. We then get a move towards some sort of happiness here. The dove, which represents her son's soul, is free now, although it's pulling freely. So again, this is slightly oxymoronic. Pulling suggests that it's trapped in some way, but it's pulling towards freedom. It's going to the sky, which again is positive, but it's actually against the sky. It's struggling still, and this perhaps reflects her struggle to accept her son's death. She wants to see her soul as moving towards heaven, or rather his soul, sorry, but actually she's also faced with this terrible grief at his physical loss. Then finally in this reading, she hears or wants to hear his playground voice, the voice that she used to hear when he was a small child, and she's hoping that it will come to her on the wind. In one sense, this of course is a memory that she wants to return to. She wants to remember her son when she could still protect him when he was young and innocent and not at war. Or we might delve further into this and say that it might also suggest that she's wanting his soul to revisit her, and it's his actual voice that she's expecting to hear, as though he's going to come back from the dead. Now, amazingly, that's just one interpretation of the poem, and I'll give you the next interpretation in my next video. If you'd like to know more, don't forget to subscribe.